Hi there, it's Bronwyn. Welcome back to Before Dining. I plan to use today to answer a few general questions from recent episodes. But after the last 3 episodes on Access Agency and Alison's story, a lot of questions came in specifically about that. And Alison's story in particular struck a chord with many of you. What I heard again and again was not confusion about the details, but a lot of recognition. Women could see parts of their own story in hers, and not because anything extreme had happened, but because the patterns were just very familiar. So instead of moving on, I want to stay here a little longer. So in this episode, I'm going to respond to the questions that have been coming through and talk more directly about the things that Alison's story brings up, especially around the role of shame and how it keeps eating patterns in place. If the last few episodes left you thinking, this feels relevant, but I can't quite explain why, then hopefully this conversation will put some words around that. But a word of warning, as I work through these questions today, I want you to hear them not as problems to fix, but as signposts. They really do point to the place where understanding is starting to replace judgment, and that's an important place to begin. So let's look at what the first question was. Many of you were surprised that the ordinary circumstances of Alison's life could end up causing a lifelong weight battle. And that's exactly the reason I wanted to tell Alison's story, because it's very tempting to explain eating patterns by finding one clear reason that makes everything add up. But often, and mostly, life is not like that. So Alison's story shows that eating systems don't need drama to be created. One of the ways they can form is through repetition. And it was that day after day, meal after meal sequence that Alison learnt that food was controlled by others. And when you're a child, it just becomes normal. You just accept that. But normal doesn't mean neutral. And look, we don't know what her parents intended, whether they intended this level of control or not. The problem was that Alison interpreted those conditions as that her needs didn't matter and that asking for what she wanted wasn't worth the trouble. And once rules like that are in place, the behaviour starts organising itself around them. By the time the weight appears decades later, the original conditions that created it are invisible, but yet the system is still running and still producing the same results. Another question was, why did everything unravel once Alison left home? You know, a lot of people thought, now that she's got this freedom, why couldn't she just make her own choices and, take things in a different direction? And it does make sense to think that way, and that's why this part of her story is so important. So when Alison left home, she didn't just gain freedom of a time, she gained full access and autonomy all at once over food, without ever having learnt how to regulate it. So no one taught her how to listen to hunger and fullness signals, or to know what the right portion size was for her. But the one thing she did learn was that she couldn't trust herself around food. So when she suddenly had this money and choice, the eating system that had been built under that pressure of restriction now had no parental boundaries to control it. And of course, the weight gain was the price that she paid. In other questions, many listeners could identify with the shame part of Alison's story, as they also want to know how can they stop the shame voices from running everything. And there's an important distinction that I want to make here, and that is she didn't make those voices disappear. Because to start with, like most of us, Alison didn't want to go anywhere near the shame because, let's face it, it feels awful. Every time she felt it, there would be this voice that said, you already know what to do, you're just too lazy to do it. Because she believed there was truth in that statement, that kept her stuck for ages, and it stopped her from looking deeper into her story. One of the turning points that came for her was when she stopped being paralysed with shame and started relating to it differently. She learnt to name the feeling when it showed up, notice where it sat in her body, and recognise the familiar voices that came with it. Much later, when she had unravelled the origin of her eating system, that shame voice lost its authority to control her. But it didn't vanish, but it was no longer running the show, and that's the big difference. So when she could move on with her life and get a bit of a distance and not be constantly attacking herself with this voice, she was able to focus on changing her relationship with food and eating. In another few questions, I suppose we could summarise these by saying, They related to, if these eating behaviours made sense to a child, how should people now think about them now that they're an adult? And that's probably the main point I want you to take in from this episode. Describing behaviours like stealing food as a child or overeating as an adult aren't bad behaviours. They were and are ways of meeting needs in environments where needs weren't or still aren't being met. So it's this reframing that's critically important about being able to leave a lot of that stuff behind. As adults, the problem is that this eating system that we've created is still running, it's unchanged, yet it's now operating in a completely different environment. What helps is reframing this eating behaviour as purpose-driven rather than self-sabotaging. Because once you see that, it becomes possible to understand the system instead of fighting against it. Most importantly, childhood behaviours like stealing food are often the silent shame that women carry. But once you make sense and see the conditions that those behaviours grew out of, hopefully there's going to be a little bit more self-compassion and a bit more self-forgiveness. Before I finish, I want to connect the dots of what we've been talking about today with these questions. The questions that came in were all slightly different on the surface. Some were about definitions of access and agency, some were about shame. Some were about why these eating behaviours continue long after circumstances have changed. But when I look at all the questions in total, underneath they were all circling the same thing. Once you recognise yourself in a story like Alison's, it can be unsettling. Not because the story doesn't make sense, but it's because it does make sense. And that raises a deeper issue. If your eating made sense once, if it formed for the understandable reasons, why does it still feel so hard to change now? And this is where we often turn back to fixing food or tightening rules because that feels active and it feels familiar. But what Alison's story shows is that understanding doesn't switch a system off. It changes how you relate to it. When you can see that your eating patterns have a long history, you can stop trying to overpower it or shame it into submission. And that shift in thinking matters because systems do not respond well to force, but they can be dismantled with understanding. So if these last few episodes have disturbed something in you, instead of thinking it's a problem, I really would like you to reframe it and think about it as a sign that you're looking in the right place. When you understand the logic of your eating system, it doesn't bring it to an end, but it does change where you look for answers and also find them. Because repeating weight gain is a life problem, not a food problem. Thanks for listening. I'll talk with you next week.